Hey Creepy Fox, I started watching your videos a couple of days back and I decided to send you this story of mine. I've changed the names of my friends in this story too, so here it is. This happened to me last spring. I live in a quiet and wealthy part of North London, and I attend a very academic, all-girls school in my neighborhood. Since my school is really academic, we were required to complete the Bronze Duke of Edinburgh. It's like a program that gives you extra credit in life as a part of the school curriculum. And as much as I didn't want to do it, I didn't have much choice in the matter. So our school is divided into 6 buildings, 4 with only classrooms, a drama department, the music block in the 6th form building, with the sports department on the 1st floor. I believe in America the 6th form are the junior and senior years. The sports department also has a huge sports hall, a bunch of offices, and a rather small playing field. The playing field is at the very back of the school campus and is never really used much. Our first expedition for Duke of Edinburgh was coming up in a couple of weeks' time, and we all felt pretty confident about it. But since we were a useless bunch of teenagers, our teachers thought that it would be helpful for us to practice setting up and sleeping in the tents overnight. I didn't like the sound of that at all. It is so utterly creepy to stay in school overnight on some little playing field at the far end of the corner of the campus, but my parents signed my permission slip. What can I say? So the day of the sleepover rolled around. We had a double PE lesson that afternoon, during which we went down to that creepy playing field to practice setting up the tents so that the night wouldn't be totally chaotic. The most disturbing part about that field was that it faces an abandoned building. Even though it was separated by a stone wall, it still looked very weird. It was one of the only abandoned houses in the entire neighborhood. The creepy house was ginormous and made out of red brick. We sat down in a semicircle while the teachers explained to us how to set everything up. I was sitting in between my best friend, let's call her Kate, and my close friend, let's call her Izzy. So Izzy was making an abnormal number of dirty jokes, referring to the teacher's speech about setting up the tent. Not gonna lie, they made it really easy for us. So Izzy and I are sitting there laughing like 2 absolute idiots, while everyone else was listening in silence, until one of the teachers said they would give us detention if we didn't behave. We giggled a little bit more, but eventually we settled down. It was now starting to get very boring. Our semicircle faced the abandoned building, so I couldn't help my eyes wandering there every few minutes. I was eagerly waiting for the talk to end when something in the background caught my eye. It was a figure standing at one of the top-story windows in the abandoned building. I couldn't see whether it was a man or woman at the time because my eyesight was bad. All I knew was that that person was wearing something really dark, like a hoodie or something similar. I looked at the blurry silhouette for a while and it seemed like the shadow was staring directly at me. I started freaking out a little bit, so I nudged Izzy, saying, "Oh my god, look." First she looked at me and then at the window that I pointed at, but when I looked up, right after Izzy, I saw the opaque curtains move a little bit, but nobody was there anymore. I also told Kate about what had just happened. Obviously, neither of them believed it and started to tease me. I laughed it off, but I still felt a tad bit nervous. We then attempted setting up our tents and our lesson came to an end. We came to school in the evening and it was really weird seeing the school without any students in it, but as I was approaching the field, I saw Kate, so I felt better. I was in the same tent as her because she was in my group of the expedition. We then later discussed all our teenage girl stuff as we tried to go to sleep. I often had trouble getting to sleep anyway, even in my own room. As expected, I was not able to fall asleep easily in the tent, so I kept on going through my phone until it was really late and I was sure that everybody was asleep, including Kate. I was now starting to drift off at around 2 a.m., but then it started to rain, and it was in that moment that I understood that I should have been listening to the teacher's explanation of how to correctly put up a tent instead of Izzy's dirty jokes. because our tent was starting to fill up with water. I imagined that we probably hadn't zipped up the outer layer of the tent properly, so I gathered every bit of strength I had left and climbed outside, leaving my phone. I struggled for a while, but ended up successfully zipping up the tent. By the time I'd finished, I was soaking wet, so I decided to grab a dry hoodie from my PE kit. We stored our sports kits inside the PE department, which had been left open in case we needed to use the bathrooms. The halls were pitch black, so I was getting really creeped out. Thus, I went into the changing room, switched the light on, and then changed into my dry hoodie. When I pushed down on the door handle in order to leave, for some reason it was stuck and it wouldn't move. It felt as if someone was holding the handle on the other side. At this point, I started to freak out a little bit, so me being the way I am, I asked quietly, "Hello?" No response. Even though I was quite scared, I could be savage and was also really strong. This time around, I asked in a very firm, clear voice, "Is there anybody there?" I'm not exactly sure what my logic was at the time. Like, did I actually think he was going to say, "Yes, hi, I'm Peter. Do you want a sandwich?" But again, there was no response. I started trying to wiggle the door handle free so hard that it actually came off in my hand, which I thought was extremely odd since the building was very newly built. And the person didn't have to hold the door anymore because I was stuck and couldn't open the door even if I really tried to. At this point, the lights went off in the changing room. The situation seemed as though it was straight out of a scary movie, but reality was catching up to me as I understood that somebody really was on the other side of the door because the light switch to the changing rooms was outside. Now, I was about to have an actual panic attack, so without thinking, I started banging and kicking at the door while screaming, "Help!" at the top of my lungs, desperately hoping that a teacher or even a security guard would hear me. But I think that it only angered the other person as I saw the part of the door which the handle was built onto slowly begin to turn. I immediately run to the other side of the changing room. It was like 2 meters away, and locked myself in one of the shower cells, which was the first place that I could think of. As soon as I locked the door behind me, I heard the door opening and heavy footsteps entering the room, which convinced me that it was a man. I tried to silence my breathing with my hand, but I don't think I did a very good job at that, as the footsteps soon stopped right before my shower cell. At first, I couldn't quite comprehend what he might be doing, but then I see an eye glaring at me through one of the gaps in between the door hinges. This was the most scared I'd ever been in my entire life. I screamed like there was no tomorrow. I was so lost because I didn't understand what I could possibly do to get out of this situation. But then it hit me. I was hoping I was strong enough to pull this off. I swung the door open as hard as I could, slamming the man directly in the face. I knew the door was open because I didn't hear it closing, and if he closed it, he would be stuck too. So I ran out of the changing room and down the hallway while screaming so loudly that my own ears started to ring. The building was about 20 meters away from the playing field, so I ran as fast as I could while screaming at the top of my lungs, which woke up the majority of people asleep in the tents. I had a panic attack and couldn't breathe for a good 10 minutes. Later, I explained to the teachers what had happened. They called our version of 911, but the man was never found, probably because I'd given him plenty of time to escape. Everyone was sent home straight after that, but I remember clear as day that as I was running away, I turned around and saw the figure in the dark hoodie that I had seen standing in that window earlier in that day. That night still haunts me, even now. Okay, so me, my son, and my mom, we went for a drive one evening and we had stopped at this part of the highway that has a glacier running down the mountainside. It's truly breathtaking and beautiful. Anyway, all was good and we were talking and sitting there having some Arby's and enjoying the peace and quiet. Suddenly, we started to hear something coming from the woods. Now, I've hunted before, so I'm very familiar with different noises that animals make. They sounded like no animal I'd ever heard. Therefore, I took out my phone and used this app which, when having access to your microphone, it can help identify various noises. It gives me mountain lion, and I start relaxing knowing we didn't just stumble into some scary unknown creature who would come out of nowhere and eat us up for dinner. Back to the food. I had my hand resting on the window as I took a bite out of some curly fries, and then I felt something lick my hands. Naturally, I was startled. I retrieved my arm and turned the flashlight on my iPhone. What I saw was super freaky. Instead of a mountain lion, a bear, a wolf, or some other furry creature, it was a woman. Yes, no kidding, here in the middle of nowhere, with a ripped up bikini top and bottoms that were ripped to shreds. I then flashed the light into the nearby woods thinking I'd seen something, and we see an even more disturbing sight. 4 other people in hoodies. I knew at this very moment this was some sort of setup, but I don't think these freaks knew who the occupants in the car were, that being myself, my son, and my mother. Now, I did have bear mace and I was going to use it, but instead we pulled out of there and we went to a nearby gas station. While we talked with the clerk, I brought up the creepy incident. He paused for a brief moment, and I pressed him to give me answers since I noticed he knew more than he led on to believe. I was told that area used to have a hospital that was built back in the 1700s, but it closed around 1945. It was being used by a family who would set up muggings, and there is a woman who would go up to people's cars and try to get them to get out. She would then lead them into the nearby woods, where the accomplices were waiting. Why she licked my hands, I don't really know. Needless to say, we never went back there again. This takes place in Southern California in the 1990s. I wanted to share this after listening to the video you did about scary school stories. Although this doesn't have to do with school necessarily, I was in a way able to relate to the first one about the Cal State Fullerton lockdown and those guys who robbed a pawn shop and then stormed onto the university filled with students. I was just getting out of my internship from the dentist I worked at, and I was going to Domino's Pizza to pick up some food for my family, a weekly tradition we always looked forward to. While I drove, I could see and hear a bunch of helicopters flying in the sky. I knew right away it had to be some sort of police chase, as it was very rare to see any sort of aerial activity in my part of town. I remember laughing and telling myself, wouldn't it be crazy if I would be on TV? I spoke too soon. When I reached the Domino's, I parked right in front of the store, and then I waited for about 15 minutes as the pizza was being prepared. I remember there being a little TV in the lobby area, and one other man was watching it with me. Strangely enough, I got the confirmation that I had earlier suspected, a police chase that had apparently started near LA County, but had now moved to Orange County, where I was currently located. I recognized the freeway the car was driving on, the 91, and saw the helicopter pan across some familiar buildings and businesses. Bear in mind, the chase wasn't too far off from where I was currently located. Anyway, the man who was waiting in the lobby with me eventually left, meaning it was just myself and the 3 other employees. I ended up taking my eyes off of the TV for a couple of minutes so I could go use the restroom. It's in there the helicopters began to grow louder alongside the police sirens. I began thinking the chase was now off the freeway and had made its way into the city. So I finished my business, washed my hands, and can hear the sirens and the blades of the helicopters getting louder and louder. No way that chase would have made it this close, could it? I kid you not. To this day, I will never forget it. As soon as I exit the restroom, a man runs into the store and then bumps past me, causing me to fall and hit my bottom. I saw him run into the kitchen area, which was followed by the cooks screaming at the top of their lungs. Police officers stormed into the Domino's and I just pointed in the direction of where the man had gone. At this point, the employees in the back had jumped over the front counter and joined me at the storefront, where police escorted us to safety. After about a minute, police exit the Domino's and they have the man in handcuffs, where there are now a bunch of witnesses standing in the parking area. As it turned out, the man had stolen a vehicle in Compton and led the police on a very crazy chase that I just so happened to have witnessed the ending to. Now, if you're wondering what was so scary about the entire thing, it's that the man had a gun in the glove compartment. Thank God he never actually took it with him into the store, because I think things might have turned into a whole different situation. Perhaps it could have been where he might have taken a hostage. Anyway, I know this isn't your typical scary story, but I figured I'd share it with the Creepy Fox family, as I think it's a nice break from the usual tales of creeps and being stalked. Not to say that those aren't scary enough. Edit, I've been trying to find the footage of the news broadcast here on YouTube, but I haven't been able to. I think in part to it being lost to time, and maybe it's lost media. After all, this was over 20 years ago. Any of my friends who live in the Orange County area and remember the details to this incident, it'd be great to hear from you, even though I know the chances of that are quite unlikely. Just thought I'd try. Back in 2013, for roughly a month or so, I couldn't help but get a strange feeling anytime I was home. I just couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being watched. Add on top of items being placed in different locations, something about being alone at night gave me the chills. Now, I want to preface by saying what I experienced had nothing to do with anything paranormal, although at first that was my conclusion. I also want to bring up that I had another roommate at the time, Juliet, but she was rarely home due to her being the singer of a small indie band. They aren't super famous or anything, but they do travel across the country to try and get their names out there, although as of recently she's taken a break due to all the lockdown stuff. Anyway, at the time this occurred, she only showed up to the house once a week in a roughly 30-day span. That's why anytime I noticed things being out of place, I wrote them down as her. Still, I wish I would have spoken up, because that would have saved me a whole lot of trouble. For example, I would hear bumps in the night, but my lazy self always wrote it down to squirrels or other backyard animals, as we are close in proximity to a forest. One night I had arrived home from work early because I wasn't feeling too great. As I pulled up into my driveway, head beating like a drum and rain hitting my windshield, I saw a shadow pass by my window, being masked by the curtains. My first instinct was that this was one of those rare occasions that I would see my roommate Juliet, but why she didn't text me, I found odd, as she always notifies me anytime she's going to be home. Regardless, I step out of the vehicle and I make a mad dash toward the front porch, getting drenched from the downpour in the process. As I put my key into the keyhole, something in me told me to stop. It's something that I can't really put into words, sort of like a higher power looking out for me and saying, "You better turn around right now." I ignore these warnings as my body being exhausted and enter the home heading toward the kitchen to grab myself some water. Here's when it happens. There's someone standing in front of the refrigerator drinking out of the milk carton. As their back was turned, I wasn't sure who it was, but one thing was obvious. Juliet never drinks out of the carton. She pours the milk into a cup, just like myself. So I switch on the light, and that's when I get my answer. A disheveled looking man. My immediate reaction was to scream and then reach into my purse to grab my pepper spray. "Who are you? And who gave you permission to come in?" The man just stood there staring at me for a number of seconds before explaining he was friends with Juliet. I told the man that he needed to leave now, disregarding whether or not he knew her, and to my surprise, this actually worked. He walks into the living room and then proceeds to exit through the front door. I was so scared that my first instinct was to call the police, who showed up in record time. They, thank the heavens, managed to catch the man who was hiding in the back alleyway that's right behind our home. Now, what I hadn't realized was that this guy was actually a fan of Juliet's, who had grown obsessed with her. However, Juliet had no clue he would ever find her home, nor break in and act as if her home, mine as well, was his. Apparently, this guy had been planning on waiting for the perfect night to confess his feelings to Juliet, and in the meantime, he was living inside the attic, which, when I went up there with police officers, we found a bunch of food wrappers, empty water bottles, and even some pillows and blankets that had gone missing. There was even a laptop, toilet paper, and a couple of disposable cameras. That explained the sounds I heard some nights. Get this, he had not only learned and memorized our schedules of being in and out of the house, but he had also stolen one of the keys we kept hidden in one of the planters. You don't need to tell me how bad of an idea it is to leave spare keys lying around, but then again, you shouldn't have to worry about that to begin with. Anyway, in summary, we ended up selling the place and I moved about 2 hours north. Meanwhile, Juliet found a place with her new boyfriend. I haven't really talked to her since, but last I checked, she was living happily. This just happened last week and it's still fresh in my head. I was bored and decided to set up a small tent in my backyard where I would spend the night making s'mores and looking up at the stars. My parents were busy renovating the house anyway, and my room was currently being painted. That's why when they asked me if I wanted to sleep in their room, I opted for the backyard. The last thing I wanted was to be awoken by my dad's heavy snoring. I can't tell you how many times I regretted going on family vacations and having to share the same room with my dad. Sorry, Dad, but your snoring is way too loud. Anyway, to keep me company, I had my pit bull Rocco, who, for those who want to know, he's an absolute sweetheart. Don't try to get on his bad side, however. So after dinner, we watched a movie, and then my mom and dad went to bed once it was done. This was the point I go outside and get started on our little fire pit. I now began making the s'mores, and Rocco soon joins me. After getting my fill, I take out my laptop and start playing Minecraft, looking up at the night sky every so often. Close to 11 p.m., my eyes are feeling really heavy, and I decide it's time to crawl into the tent. I now zipped up the tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and then Rocco and I soon drift off to La La Land. Fast forward to roughly 2 in the morning, and I am awoken by Rocco, who is growling and acting restless. "What's wrong, Rocco? You need to go potty?" This was his secret word. Rocco looks up at me and starts jumping like a kid on a sugar rush. This indicates to me I was correct. I slowly zip the tent down, and then Rocco, almost like on cue, jumps out and beelines it toward the house. You see, I wasn't aware at the moment, but as we were sleeping, someone had managed to get into our backyard. Everything in this moment goes by fairly quickly, thus I'm going to break it all down for you. To start, my tent was at the far end of the property, right next to my father's tool shed. The tent itself was camouflage color, and unless you were actively searching, you wouldn't even have noticed it was set up. Continuing with the recollection, whoever was trying to open the back door, wearing all black clothing and a ski mask, immediately stops what they're doing and books it toward the side fence. They don't get too far, however, as Rocco tackles them to the back lawn like a quarterback football player making a catch. I saw something fly toward one of the bushes, and it wouldn't be until police got there that I realized what it was. My dad, hearing the sudden commotion, runs out of the house and sees quite the strange sight. Rocco chomping down onto a burglar's sweater, and myself standing there completely frozen with fear. My dad manages to grab Rocco, and the burglar immediately runs to the front yard. However, I don't know if it was pure luck on our side or someone from above looking out for us, but a police officer just so happened to have been patrolling the neighborhood. My dad manages to wave down the police officer and tells him that the man running away was trying to break into our house. The police officer chased after him and soon was able to get him into handcuffs. More police officers arrived soon thereafter, and they looked around our property. This was when I remember seeing something go flying from the burglar's hands just earlier. I led the officers to the bush, and what we discovered sent chills down everyone's spine. A gun, more specifically, a revolver. I'm so thankful to God that he hadn't had the opportunity to use it, because otherwise this story might have turned out a lot worse. I'm also thankful for Rocco being that ever so protective dog he is. He ended up getting extra treats the next few days, and we even bought him some new toys to show our gratitude. We are currently in the process of getting an alarm system set up, and if there are any updates or any other scary incidents, I'll make sure to share them with the creepy fox so you can all listen. Who doesn't enjoy playing some Call of Duty Zombies? Show of hands. Yeah, I'm a huge fan myself, especially from Black Ops 1 and Black Ops 2. The scary encounter was in the summer of 2013 when the final DLC for Black Ops 2 released. Sure, you had the new multiplayer maps, but I was more focused on the Zombies map, Origins. Even today, I'll hop on Xbox with friends and we will relive the glory days of trying to beat the Easter egg. But okay, enough of that. It was on a Friday since the DLC came out during the week, and I was playing with 3 other friends. We will call them Drew, Zach, and Kevin. My mom and dad were still at work at the time, and they would be getting home a little later than usual since they were going to go to Costco to get some groceries. I do have a sister, but she was hanging out with her boyfriend, meaning it's just me at the house. It's not a problem since I was already 19 years old. At about 7:15, my mom calls me and she says, "Hey honey, could you go ahead and set up the table and get some cups out? We're going to get a pizza here from Costco. We should be home by 8 o'clock." My mother more or less said. I told my friends I needed to set something up, so we made a crawler and I waited at the back of generator number 6. I now head to the kitchen, which is just down the hallway, and I begin taking out all the utensils. When I opened the trash bin to throw something away, I saw it was full. I knew my parents would call me lazy if I didn't take out the trash. Therefore, I tie up the top and walk to the side of the house to throw everything away. As I make my way back through my side gate door, I see a piece of paper had fallen out of the trash bag. I go to reach for it, and then all of a sudden I hear the gate open. "You guys are back?" Before I could finish my sentence, I'm staring face to face with a homeless man. At least I assumed he was, due to his clothing. He was tall, about 6'2", and was very skinny. Kind of reminded me of those drug users you see hanging out around liquor stores. He had thin long hair, his eyes were red, as if he had just finished smoking something, and I did notice he was acting very bizarrely, as in shaking, almost like being paranoid. Hey, I think you might have the wrong home here, buddy," I told him with a nervous smile, beginning to walk back to my door. "Hey, do you have any drink in your refrigerator?" "Excuse me? Are you talking about beer?" I responded back, getting this sudden feeling in my head that told me, just run, don't ask. "Yeah, do you have any beer on you? Please, I'll give you some money." "Nah, dude, we don't have anything like that here. I think you need to leave now." I was now inside my kitchen and double-locked the door. I watched as the man stumbled into my backyard before I could see him head to one of the windows. I followed them over there, and when I see him for the second time, I'm left shocked. He's cutting up the window screen with a box cutter. "Dude, I told you to stop. Get out of here. What's your problem?" He started to curse and call me by all these different obscenities, saying he was going to come into the house, whether I liked it or not, and he was going to stab me. No way was I going to let that happen. I take out my cell phone and start dialing for the police. While on the line with dispatch, I see through the same window a neighbor on the other side of the fence telling this guy to leave. My neighbor, who we will call Joseph in this story, is this really old school tough guy who might seem like a jerk on the outside, but he's a huge teddy bear when you get to know him. I consider him almost like an uncle. Joseph saw me through the window talking on my cell phone, and I think he got a general idea of who I was talking to. A minute later, Joseph and his brother, who just so happened to have been visiting at the time, managed to come and disarm the man and keep him detained until police got there to question him. I saw this all from the safety of my living room, by the way. Turned out the guy was high on drugs, as they found a little bag on him and even a glass pipe as well. That was all hiding in his backpack. My parents actually got home just as the man was put behind their police cruiser. Imagine their shock when they saw the scene. My mom immediately runs over to me and gives me one of the hugest and tightest hugs she'd ever given to me. By the way, in case you're wondering, my phone was full of text messages from my Xbox buddies letting me know the next round had accidentally started, and we all got wrecked, as us gamers like to call it. I did enjoy some amazing pizza afterwards, and spent the rest of that weekend playing Call of Duty, putting the scary encounter behind me. I now live a couple of cities over, and I'm engaged to my soon-to-be wife, with a baby boy now on the way. Hey Creepy Fox, I hope you're doing well. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your videos. I've been enjoying your narrations for over a year now. I don't know why, but listening to creepy stories is just my way to relax after a long day. Luckily, I haven't had a lot of creepy encounters or things like that happening to me in real life, so this will be the first time when I send in my own story for you to share on your channel. This happened just today and I'm still quite shocked, so I feel I really need to share this with someone, and that's going to be you. For some background, I'm a 30-year-old female, and I live in Poland, and I spend quite a lot of my free time traveling and cycling. I have some experience in solo trips, as I've traveled to many countries in Europe and cycled around Poland mostly on my own. However, I'm rather a city girl. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy spending time in nature, but I usually don't wander very far from the urban areas, because being in the middle of nowhere, especially alone, makes me quite anxious. Anyway, my overall experience with traveling and cycling has been very positive so far. I have had a lot of unforgettable adventures, and I've met some really lovely people along the way. This summer, due to the current worldwide circumstances, I decided to stay in my country and just explore some new areas. I've recently bought a new trekking bike, and I was really excited to try it out. I've had a few really great trips by the seaside as well as in my city. I live in one of the largest cities in Poland. For privacy reasons, I won't share my exact location, but it is also surrounded by beautiful nature, forests, rivers, mountains, and countryside. Today, I decided to go a little further than usual and explore a new area outside of the city. I crossed some really picturesque places, meadows, rivers, forest, fields, and I finally got to a nice bike trail that led to the countryside. I rode there for a while, passing by a few villages, until I saw a meadow with cows next to a bridge. I decided to stop there for a moment, drink some water, and check my location on an app on my phone. Please keep in mind that I was still staying on the bicycle trail, and there were other people going by every now and then. After a few minutes, I noticed an elderly woman standing on the other side of the trail and staring directly at me. At first, I didn't pay much attention to her, although she was starting to make me feel a little bit uncomfortable. She looked really old, like she was around 100 years old. She was wearing old clothing and had an unpleasant expression on her face. But still, I assumed it was just one of those elderly ladies who don't have much to do, so they just like to stare disapprovingly at younger people. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people like that where I live. Once I pulled out my phone to check my exact location, I heard the woman shout something like, "Go away, get the heck out of here." Of course, she was shouting in Polish, and it's hard to even translate exactly what she said, as such expressions don't even exist in the English language. Let's just say that she said it in a very rude way that would suggest that she was talking to a dog or another animal, so that's what I assumed. There were also the cows in the meadow on the other side of the trail, so I thought that she was talking to them, or maybe some other animal that was bothering them. But when I looked around, I didn't see any other animals. The woman started to now approach me, still staring at me with an angry expression, and then I noticed that she was holding a big hammer in her hand. "Get the heck out of here with that cell phone," she shouted, and now it was clear that she was talking to me. I was really shocked and speechless for a moment. Seeing that, she started to shout the same obscenities in broken German, probably assuming that I was a German tourist and I didn't understand her. "Excuse me?" I just asked, this time getting more angry than scared or shocked. "Leave me alone, or I'll use my cell phone to call the police," I shouted to this nutcase as I was getting away from her on my bicycle. I was riding quite fast and wearing a helmet, like I always do. However, I've never thought that I would need to protect myself from crazy old people. Anyway, I wasn't really scared anymore at this point because I didn't think that this old and overweight woman would run or throw her hammer far enough to reach me. And besides, there were other people passing by, so I didn't think she would try anything in front of them. I just got really angry. I was, after all, on a public bicycle trail, not on her private property, and she had no right to speak to me like that, let alone chase me with a hammer. I suppose that she was one of those poorly educated folks who really believe that cell phones or any kind of technology can harm them, their crops, animals, or whatever. I had met some crazy people before, but nothing like that had ever happened to me before, and I hope it will never happen again. I didn't have much choice, and I had to go back the same way in order to enter the city. But luckily this time there were no traces of the old woman. And before you ask, yes, I reported this to the police later and I gave them the location of where it happened. I don't know what was wrong with her, and I don't want this to happen to anyone else who passes by just because they use their phone. So, crazy lady, I hope the police will send someone to check up on you soon. To this day, I'm so thankful for having a friend with me. I really think that if it weren't for him, things might have been different for me. And I'm not saying that just to say it, I really do mean it. Back in 2013, I was going through a pretty bad time in my life. I'd rather not get into it, but I will say that I needed to get away from home. That spring semester, just a few weeks before finals, I started looking into group vacation tours. If you're completely lost with what I'm talking about, I'll give you just a quick TLDR. They are essentially tours that you can sign up with that will take you to various cities and countries. The more popular ones, such as the one I did, was a 2-week group tour through Europe in which you were guided by a couple of tour guides. The size of the group depends. For example, mine was 25 people. Normally, you'll stay in one city for 2 days, one to learn its history and check out the landmarks, and then another to do some shopping and your own exploration. I mainly wanted to do this guided tour as a way to see the world, since my parents always encouraged I do so. Now, because this story could potentially become a novel, I'm not going to tell you about each and every city we stayed in and the boring events that took place. If anyone wants to hear the full story, I could always write it out, and I guess I could ask the creepy fox to include it as an extra for a future video, since I love his voice. I want to focus on night number 2, when we were staying in Berlin, Germany. By this point in the tour, it had been a little over a week, and I'd made friends with another person in my group. We will call him Alex. Alex is 26 years old and from New Jersey. Meanwhile, I'm 24 years old and from Oregon. Alex and I decided to meet up at around 5 p.m. so we could take a walk in the food market. Who knew that walk would turn into hours of talking and buying things. I can't tell you how many souvenirs I bought just in that city. By 7 p.m., we're starting to get pretty hungry. One of the shop owners we talked to that was selling some handmade dream catchers recommended a bakery just around the corner from where she was. She said her nephew owned the place and would be more than happy to give us a discount if we gave him her name. Honestly, the old lady was too sweet for words. Too bad this is the point in the story when things were about to go from fun and innocent to downright horrifying. Now I should mention that I don't speak any German whatsoever, but Alex is fluent. That's why he was the translator. So we did end up going to that bakery, and just like the woman said, their sandwiches were incredible. Alex and I decided to sit outside along with some other guests, and it's while we're talking, Alex overheard something that seemed to raise some serious alarms. "Alex, what's the deal? Why do you look so paranoid? Do you have your phone on you? I'm going to pretend to text someone, but I'm texting you. I want you to read what I'm going to tell you. Don't ask." Strange, but okay. I played along with his little game. All the while I can see him looking behind me. We were using WhatsApp in case you're wondering. I received his message and it said something along the lines of, "Try not to freak out, but I could have sworn the guys behind you mentioned something about grabbing you when we leave this restaurant." I looked at Alex and burst into laughter. "Alex, you're too funny, aren't you? As if something like that would really happen." Alex reassured me that he wasn't joking and he was being serious, but he did admit it was possible he might have just been hearing things. Either way, Alex continued to talk to me while paying close attention to the men that were sitting at the table just inches from where I was. When dessert arrived, Alex got up from our table and then, without holding anything back, shouted something to the men in German. I won't even attempt writing that part out, but I'll write it out in English from what he later told me. "I don't know what you two are planning, but keep it up and the police will be called." Finally, I took this opportunity to look in the direction of where Alex spoke, and I could see the look of shock on these men's face. I'm not one to judge, but there was something about the smirks on their face that read, "Immediate danger." Alex proceeded to leave money on the table and then grabbed my hand. We left that restaurant, but I was trying to get Alex to stop and explain why exactly he let out that outburst, since I'm pretty sure they weren't expecting him to speak fluent German. "I know what I heard. They were talking about you. They wanted to kidnap you." I was taken aback by that statement and started thinking of all the stories I'd read about people being kidnapped in different countries. We decided to head back to the hotel, but to make things even worse, the two men from the restaurant were stalking us. Meanwhile, one of them was on the phone speaking to someone. It wasn't until we were just across the street from the hotel that we see the men get into a vehicle and they drive away, never for us to see them again. I know my submission, it might not be the scariest thing you've ever heard, and I don't blame you for thinking that, but just imagine for a second. Imagine being in a country where you don't even know the language, and you got some dudes talking about kidnapping you. I can safely say that if Alex wasn't there, or if he didn't speak and understand German, I may have never made it back home. Thankfully, we were able to put the experience behind ourselves because we went to Paris the following day. I still keep in touch with Alex, and I contacted him just a week ago so that he could help me recount this tale to submit to you. I got him into your channel and he told me he would send you a couple of his own scary stories sometime. I'm sure they're better than mine. But anyway, thanks for listening to my submission. This happened about 15 years ago. I was with my friend and we were hanging out at his house. He lives out in the countryside, by the way, and is surrounded by acres of forestry. This itself creates an amazing opportunity. With miles of trails to explore, it's no wonder we spent our summer afternoons riding our bicycles. This afternoon it started the same, but with a twist. My friend mentions he wanted to take me to this abandoned home that he explored with his cousins a few weeks ago. It sounded kind of creepy, but cool at the same time. It was about a 20-minute bicycle ride, but we eventually made it. Now, before I continue, let me give you a quick description. It's an abandoned 2-story home from the 90s that was left by an elderly couple that my friend's family were friends with back in the day. Surprisingly, it still stood, and a lot of items the family owned were left intact. Anyway, when we head inside, we found some leftover furniture, documents, and some old toys like teddy bears and jack-in-the-boxes. Really old antique stuff, to be honest. Not even 5 minutes later, we began to hear knocks on the windows. My friend and I looked at each other with the expression of, "Was that you?" It couldn't have been me since we were literally inches apart from each other, which is why we stand there and listen. Nothing. So we now assumed we had just heard the sounds of the tree branches scratching against the house, or maybe a squirrel or some other wild animal. Either way, it didn't stop us from investigating the source of the disturbance. We head upstairs and began to head down a hallway. That's when we heard a loud crash coming from a room further up ahead of us, followed by footsteps. "Who's in here?" we hear the voice of a man say in anger. We had no time to react, and we decided to jump into the room next to us. Yes, I know we could have just run down the hallway and out the front door, but who knows if somebody could have been waiting out there. Anyway, it looked to be like a really big room because, well, obviously it was huge. There was still an old bed and a dresser and a bunch of spider webs and dust. We chose to run into an old closet and hid in there for what seemed like hours. Meanwhile, we can still hear the voice of the man. About 20 seconds later, we hear his footsteps enter the room we were currently hiding in. Because the closet had some cracks in the door, we were just able to make out the man. He was in a hoodie and torn up jeans and looked to be like he was in his 40s. He had long, greasy dark hair and wore what appeared to be like reading glasses. But this information will soon be obsolete because we had bigger problems to deal with. The guy has a double-barrel shotgun. We both went cold as we hold our hands against our mouth, trying to mask the sound of our breathing. Honestly, we were expecting this was going to be the end, but by some sort of miracle, the man doesn't check inside the closet and instead curses under his breath, saying to himself he must have just been hearing things. We then chose to wait another 2 to 3 minutes and decided to crawl out of the window onto the rooftop. We then climbed to the front lawn below before getting on our bicycles and never looking back again. Your guess is as good as mine to what the man was doing there and what his intentions could have been. By the way, the home was demolished a couple of years later, so his identity still remains a mystery to this very day. The following story was sent in from a subscriber of mine who asked to remain anonymous. This was sent in to me on May 7th, 2018. Also, just so you're aware, the person who submitted this story uses the word conservatory, which for those living in the United States, it's equivalent to a glass house. One last note. Some of the wording and details have had to be changed in order to comply with YouTube's strict guidelines. But anyway, here's how the submission goes. This happened not that long ago, and we were invited to a close relative's house for dinner. There were 9 older teenagers and 6 kids, and all the parents and kids decided to go to the park as it was a hot, sunny day, and the kids were constantly nagging the parents to take them to the park. The 9 of us decided to stay because we were in the middle of watching a movie in the front room. Now, the house layout was different to the other houses on the street. As you walked in the front door, there were stairs to the left leading to a landing where the rooms and bathroom led off from. As you walk straight down a long corridor, you reach a set of doors. One is for the kitchen, one for the front living room, and one for a small closet used for coats, shoes, and the filter and pump for the fish pond. Through the kitchen, there was another door leading to the conservatory, which could also be accessed through the back area of the front room. The room was really large and was split into 2, a living/cinema room and a dining room. We were in the front watching a movie and the curtains were closed because it was sunny and the light was disturbing us. Our oldest cousins were upstairs in one of the rooms using their phones. They decided to also close the curtains of the upstairs rooms. As the movie was nearly finished, I saw a shadow in the garden at the far side of the conservatory. I ignored it and continued watching. The sound of the movie was not that loud, as our older cousins told us to keep the sound down because they needed to hear if we called them at any time. Again, I saw the shadow and looked to see what it was. There were no trees in the garden, nor in either of the neighbors' gardens, so I realized it couldn't have been a tree. I looked closer and then heard my cousin scream. She walked to the kitchen to put the snacks and drinks away and saw the figure standing in the corner of the conservatory outside looking at her. She locked the doors of the back and my older cousins came downstairs asking what had just happened. The person hadn't seen my older cousins come down and assumed that we were on our own. He started to rattle the doorknob, trying to open it. We all ran up, leaving our older cousins downstairs to sort the situation out on their own. They called the police, and the man had managed to enter the conservatory. He looked around to see if he could spot us, but he didn't, and continued to break the back door which led to the conservatory. My oldest cousin, 19 at the time, went as discreetly as he could to the kitchen to grab all the knives he could to defend themselves as well as to make sure the intruder wasn't armed. He still had not seen my older cousins and tried to enter. Then the sound of the police siren alerted him and he made a run for it and managed to make an escape. The officers entered the house, entered and checked the back door and the pathway behind the back fence of the house. With no luck, they returned home and our parents had also been told of what had just happened. The police officers asked if anyone had seen him and my cousin and I gave a description of what we saw. Fast forward a few weeks later, a similar incident had happened just one street down from my cousin's house, and the intruder was caught. Our parents were told, and recently I found out that the man was on a national criminal predator register list and was charged with some pretty crazy crimes. Now, remember how in the intro to this story I told you I couldn't go into great details due to YouTube's strict guidelines? Well, it turned out that some of the things he did, they were really bad to say the least. Unfortunately, I can't tell you, otherwise YouTube will completely age restrict the video. It's happened to other narrators. Anyway, back to the story. I still wonder to this day if my cousin hadn't screamed when she saw him and my older cousins hadn't called the police. What would have happened to us? And what would he have done? This is the first time I've shared this online with anyone, so please go easy on me. First, some background context. This is from the late 1990s when I was on a business trip in Mexico. I was working for a clothing company that manufactured wedding dresses. Also, I'm female and I was roughly 28 or 29 years of age. Now, when most people see me, they don't think I speak or understand Spanish. After all, here is this light-skinned, blonde-hair, blue-eyed American girl from New York. You'd be surprised, but I actually studied Spanish 3 years in high school and 1 year in college. Sure, I had a funny accent, but I understood pretty much any conversation. I truly believe this would save me. Anyway, with me on this business trip were 2 other co-workers of mine, who we will call Julia and Danny. We each stayed in our own hotel rooms and checked in on a Tuesday morning. After a bit of rest, we met up with a couple of the company representatives we were to meet and spent the rest of the afternoon talking and demonstrating our clothing line. They really enjoyed our presentation, and as a reward, they invited myself, Julia, and Danny to an all-you-can-eat buffet. We ate like kings and queens, that by the time we were done, I couldn't move. Luckily, the next day would be a day of rest, so there was no need to worry about being out late. After sitting around the buffet and talking, we went to a bar that was across the street and spent about an hour having drinks and listening to the music. At one point, I had to use the restroom, so I excused myself. The thing was, the restroom was out in the back, which meant I had to exit through the front entrance, walk back into a dark, lonely alleyway, and then head into the little stall to take care of my business. I'm sure you can already tell where this might be going. As I exit the bar, I accidentally bumped into someone. He was an older gentleman, somewhere in his mid to late 40s. He was average height and build. He's bald, tattoos on his arms, and a look that said, "Watch where you're going, or you're going to get shanked." I apologized in Spanish and start to walk away, but he instead grabs and pulls me closer. I'll go ahead and write the Spanish parts in English so that you can better understand. "What's the rush, beautiful? Want to get some drinks with my friends and I?" "Sorry, I'm already here with someone. I hope you have a good night." I push away from his grasp as he starts to follow me out of the bar. "Come on, mamacita. Maybe I came off the wrong way. I'll buy you something. I never see too many pretty blonde girls like you." "For the last time, no. Now can you please leave me alone, or I'll get the security guard." I didn't have to because the security guard overhears the conversation and asks the man what was wrong. I couldn't believe what he tells him. He says that I was his wife of all things, and we were just having a little argument. As if. I decided to just hold it in and return to my friends, telling them about the creep I stumbled into. They agreed it was pretty creepy and we just decided to leave. However, we still had to get to our hotel, which was about a 10-minute walk. How I wish we could have just called a taxi, but we decided the streets were busy and lit enough for us to make it there safely. To be honest, we just didn't want to waste any more money on something so mundane. Anyway, before we knew it, the once lively streets, with all the restaurants and bars, started to grow distant and quiet. We were now about 5 minutes from the hotel, walking alongside a couple of beach houses. What happens in the next few seconds was a life changer. Just to give you a visual, I was closest to the street, followed by Julia in the middle, and then Daniel at the very far end. We all of a sudden hear the sound of a car approaching, then what sounds like a door being opened. Before I knew it, I was being pulled into a van. Those moments seemed to go off in slow motion. When I looked to my right, I saw a familiar face, the guy from the bar. So this was his plan: wait until we were away from any witnesses and then try to kidnap me. By some miracle, he hadn't gotten a proper grasp of me, which allowed Julia and Daniel to pull me back. I fell on top of them. The last thing I remember was the van speeding away, never to be seen again. I was in shock that it wasn't until we got back to the hotel I had a panic attack and cried for almost 30 minutes straight. I couldn't believe I was almost abducted, and it's scary to think it can happen at the most random time. I truly believe had my coworkers not been there with me to pull me back, I most likely would have never seen my family or friends again. That thought still haunts me to this day. By the way, the police were of almost no help and never did call us back with any updates. Regardless, we made it back to the United States without any further altercations. For some context, I live in California in a small town. I'm 14 years of age and about 5 foot 9 inches. This means I'm a lot taller than most of my peers. Anyway, let me get onto this story. I'd been sick for the past week and I woke up at 5 in the morning. I felt awful, which was why I walked over to my parents' room and asked them, "I'm not feeling too well. Could I please stay home?" Both my parents agreed that I deserved a day of rest, so I went back to bed while my parents went to work and my siblings left to school. It was now around 10:30 a.m. Fast forward about an hour and I was in my living room when all of a sudden there was a knock on my front door. I got up and looked through the blinds and I saw a man in black pants with very nice white basketball shoes. He proceeded to knock for the next few minutes. I, not giving away that I was home, I texted my mom, "Hey, there's this guy that has been knocking non-stop for the past couple of minutes. What should I do?" My mother never texted back. I tried calling her, but there was no answer. Thus, I called my dad. He didn't answer either. On the second attempt, I heard a loud bang come from the door. My heart dropped in that moment, so much so I run over to my room to grab my large survival knife. I then opened the window and jumped outside. By the way, I have a one-story house, so the drop was very short. Now outside, I run through the backyard, hop over the fence, and run into the alleyway behind my house. I then proceeded to call police over the phone while still running. I told the operator where my address was and that somebody had been trying to kick my door down. I also mentioned I was armed with a knife and that I was in the back alleyway running. I'm told to stop running when I was safe and drop the knife, then return to my home so that I could meet up with the police. As I started to gain the confidence to return, someone sees me and asks what I was doing with a large knife. I didn't answer. I chose to run, and so I could see he got on his phone and called the cops. I later learned he told them that there was somebody, that being me, running around the alleyways with a machete. When I was done running away from the guy that asked what I had been doing, the operator told me to return to the address because officers had just arrived. They searched me and then searched the house, but they didn't find anyone. The thing is, when I tried calling my parents, grandparents, or anyone for that fact, I could get a hold of no one. I eventually got a hold of someone and told them about what had occurred. The whole thing was really scary, but I'm glad it didn't turn out worse. By the way, when the cops asked me if the man had hurt me at all, I told them no. The cops then said it had appeared I'd gotten into a big fight because of the large gash on my arm, with the small wounds in my stomach and chest area. I was shirtless and had scraped against the fence and the alleyway walls. As for the knife, I went back with one of the officers so we could go get it. I needed assistance, however, because the adrenaline rush had finally worn out and I was hurting pretty badly. That was pretty much it. I never did find out who the man that tried to break down my front door was, but he did leave a large footprint on the door. This was sometime in 2013. I was in class listening to a boring lecture about art history when I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The message was something along the lines of, "Hey, remember me? It's been a long time. I hope you're doing well." I looked at the area code and saw that it was nowhere near me. I was attending school in Southern California, by the way. Well, when I looked up the number, it was from Colorado. I knew no one from Colorado, thus I ignored it until I met up with a friend later that day. "You'll never believe this, but some random number from Colorado texted me. Should I respond back?" I tell my friend. She tells me not only to do so, but to question them on how they got my phone number to begin with. So I responded and they answered almost immediately. "Sorry about that. I guess I had the wrong number. I hope you don't mind me wondering what your name is. Just thought I'd give you a proper apology." Dumb me decides to give this stranger my first name, not really thinking much about it. "Okay, apologies, Samantha. Beautiful name, by the way. I hope you have a nice day." That was until a couple of weeks later that things would change. On Facebook, I'd noticed I'd gotten a friend request from a guy named Richard. I looked at his profile, but the only pictures he had were of dogs. Cute ones, mind you. It said he was from Colorado and that he played Candy Crush. I really liked Candy Crush, and this was during a time I added friends so they could send me hearts so I could keep playing. The whole time I had made no connections with this Richard's location. A month or so after I'd accepted this Richard's request, he sends me a picture on Messenger. I open it, and it's of my house, with the caption, "Found your house. I saw you too. You're just as beautiful as I imagined." I blocked him entirely, and a day later I got a text message. Once again, I didn't recognize it. However, when I opened the text message, I am instantly reminded of who it was. The conversation I had with his phone number months ago was still there. I hadn't deleted it. Anyway, the message went on about why I was so mean and why I had blocked him on Facebook. I knew right away I could make the connection between this random Richard and that Facebook account. "How did you find out where I live? Who are you, really?" I wanted answers, and I told him I was going to tell the police. He responds with, "How can you be so cruel? We're only just beginning our fun." I block him and go to the police station later that afternoon. They told me that they would try to trace the phone number, but unfortunately the number had been disconnected. That was pretty much it. I hate to be anticlimactic here. I never got a message from this Richard person ever again, and his true identity has remained a mystery. For those wondering, sadly I don't have my old phone number with the messages anymore, as I got a new phone and number entirely. Thus why this is based off my memory and my best recollection. This happened about 7 years ago, so obviously this isn't too fresh in my head. Still, I remember enough details to recollect the memory and present it in this written format, so I hope you enjoy. I was a teenager and I was living with just my dad at the time. We lived on a small farm in the middle of nowhere in rural Arkansas, not really a place where we got any visitors. Our nearest neighbor was at least 3 miles away, and don't even get me started with the nighttime. They were so dark, and the only illumination came from our house and the moonlight above us. Add on top of that the fields around our property, it really made you feel as if you were on another planet. So it was both of us on a random evening, and it must have been after midnight. It had been raining pretty heavily, and I was awake playing some video games. My dad was fast asleep, as he was usually up early in the mornings. Anyway, I'm sitting there on the couch, minding my own business, when I started to hear a sound. It sounded like someone messing with one of the windows. The more I paid attention, the more it sounded as if it was coming from the kitchen. So I get up from the couch and nervously start to head over there. When I take a look, I happen to see a large hooded figure through the kitchen window, trying to pry it open with some sort of blade. I immediately got the chills because I knew it wasn't my father. Thus, I make a run for it, heading upstairs, where I wake up my dad, telling him that there was a possible home intruder trying to break in. He grabs the shotgun from under the bed and tells me to stay locked in the room until he returned. Now, this next part is from my dad's perspective, so I'll write out what he told me. My dad ends up heading downstairs, where standing in the kitchen was a man in a ski mask with a large hunting knife. My dad yells at him and tells him to leave, otherwise he was going to blast him into a million pieces. The man claims that he was lost and says he thought the house was abandoned. My dad wasn't falling for it and reassures him that the house was indeed occupied. So this creep just walks out without saying another thing, gets in his car, and leaves. And that was pretty much it. I know it doesn't sound too scary to all of you, but just imagine living in the middle of nowhere and some random man breaks into your house with a knife. It's not exactly something you're going to expect. I don't really talk about this experience as much as I used to, mainly because of how terrifying and traumatizing it was. Still, I feel that by sharing it here with the Creepy Fox channel, I can perhaps warn others of why it's always important to be aware of your surroundings, even if you live in a relatively safe community. With that said, I live in a fairly quiet college town in the Pacific Northwest, and this happened about a year ago. I remember it well because I was having a bad day at work. I won't get into too many details, but in summary, it had to do with customers thinking they're owed everything and anything. Seriously, it's so frustrating. But I digress. After I gotten off of work, at around 6 p.m., I drove over to a coffee bean to grab some hot chocolate. From there, I drove to a park on the outskirts of town that I frequented often to work on my art projects. I sat there watching the birds and listening to music on my iPod and just watched people walk by. 30 or so minutes in, I began to notice this man who was staring at me from a picnic table that's across this small lake. I would describe him as homeless, bald with a scruffy beard and dirty, messy clothing. He was really weird and I got a bad vibe from him right away, but just as quickly as I'd noticed him, I saw that he had left and I thought that was the end of him. Anyway, as I continued sitting there, I felt my phone vibrate. I picked it up and saw that it was my friend Sam checking up on me. I spoke to her for about 10 minutes, focusing on her gossiping, and this is when I felt the bench I was sitting on move. I turned my glance over my shoulder and saw that the homeless guy from a bit earlier was now sitting next to me with a very nervous look. But that wasn't the only thing that had my attention. He has his hands in his jacket pocket and was fiddling around with some sort of object. I tried to play it cool and not get up immediately. After all, there were still some people walking around, albeit I'm out of their sight. Still, I could scream and grab their attention if I had to. "Do you happen to have the time on you, young lady?" I gave him the time, giving him the benefit of the doubt, and then start putting my little sketchbook I carry with me back into my backpack. He continues to nervously stare at me while mumbling something under his breath, and after a few moments, I tell him to have a nice evening, and I make a brisk 3-minute walk back to my car in the parking lot. Side note, the parking lot had terrible lighting and it was really difficult to see anyone unless they were standing directly under the street lamps. Well, with that in mind, when I reached the parking lot, I turned around expecting to see him following me, but he's now gone. I sighed a breath of relief and start getting closer to my car, but then I noticed a shadow appear from behind a couple of parked vehicles. As I focused on the figure, I saw a van start to approach me from my side. I then hear the side door open, where a masked man sat there staring. After that, the figure walking toward me was revealed to be the creep from the park. He said, "Get in the van." I sorta just stood there looking at him like this was some sort of big joke, but then he reveals that he's armed. He reveals a handgun from his jacket pocket and continues to demand I get inside that van. Otherwise, I would be sorry. Now, since I was so close to my car, I chose to run. Not sure why, because he could have easily just taken me out right there and then. But regardless, I unlocked my vehicle using the button on my keys. As I put the key in the ignition, the man walks over to my car, demanding I get out, otherwise he would shoot out the windows. Me, full of adrenaline and making dumb decisions, floored it out of there, with the last sight in my rearview mirror being the creep getting inside the van. I drove immediately over to the police station and I reported the incident to authorities, and they told me they would go and investigate. To this very day, the creeps that almost abducted me have never been brought to justice. Oh yeah, just to quickly mention, a lot of my friends have told me that the sidearm he was carrying might have been a fake. I mean, the more we think about it, the more we question why he didn't just shoot out the windows like he claimed he would. I mean, if he really wanted me to get in the van that badly, he would have gone out of his way to do so. But perhaps that's why he was acting nervously when I first met him, because he thought I would catch on to his little act. I don't know. What do you think? I've heard plenty of Home Alone stories on Scary Stories channels before, but I've never thought about writing mine in. Now that it's Halloween season as I write this story out, I figured it would be a good time to go ahead and retell it, though thinking about it does give me the chills. Here's what went down. It was many years ago. I'm talking about the late 1990s, and I was home alone studying for some exams. Things were very quiet, until about 10 p.m. when I started to hear helicopters and police sirens in the distance. I found this odd seeing as my neighborhood is relatively safe. Well, only about 5 minutes pass and the sirens have gotten extremely loud. On top of that, I can hear the helicopter more or less above my house. I decide to see what's happening, so I take a peek out the window. Sure enough, I can see a helicopter shining a spotlight around my home and my neighbors' homes as well. Some of my neighbors were also on their front porches watching. Well, I watch a vehicle come to a stop in front of my yard, and then a man steps out who looked to be armed with a weapon. He was followed by about 10 police officers and highway patrol cruisers as well. The armed man runs into my backyard as police officers then gave chase. I'm pretty much standing there in disbelief, but then I hear it. The distinct sound of my back kitchen door trying to be opened, followed by footsteps and heavy breathing. I didn't know it at the time, but an armed robber who robbed a store and stole a vehicle had led police on this very crazy chase, and now that chase had led to my neighborhood, where he was able to run into my backyard and open the back door, which I had made the mistake of leaving open. Well, unlocked, I should be more exact. Anyway, What was I supposed to do? I did the only thing I could think of. I lock myself in my room and yell over to the police officers from the upstairs window. They tell me to stay put, as I then hear a bunch of officers downstairs in the living room telling someone to drop it and get down to the floor. As you probably already guessed, I'm sitting there behind my bed, rocking back and forth, scared beyond recognition. Finally, however, after what seemed like hours, but was more like 3 minutes, I heard an officer on his speaker say, "You can come out now. We've caught him." Nervously, I look out the window and I can see a man being led to a police cruiser in handcuffs. Anyway, that was pretty much my story. I didn't get any studying done the rest of that evening, but I did get interviewed in the local news, so that was kinda cool. To preface this creepy experience, I work at a small coffee shop that opens daily at 4 in the morning. That means I leave my house approximately 1 hour beforehand. This was something that took a while to get used to, but eventually it became part of my routine. Normally I do drive to work, but on this one weekday I ended up taking my bicycle since my car was in the shop getting work done. It's about a 30-minute bicycle ride through downtown Montreal that has me past various buildings and a couple of parks. Nothing too crazy. As for the people roaming around at that hour, it's usually homeless people, but they always mind their own business. Anyway, fast forward to around 3:30 a.m. I just arrived at my shop and it's just myself in the quiet dark of the night. I was parking my bicycle and just grabbing my belongings when from out of nowhere I began to hear grumbling, sort of like somebody talking to themselves. So I look around and that's when I see it. Behind one of our dumpsters I saw a figure stumbling back and forth. That was pretty strange, so I stood there staring for a solid 10 seconds. Then the person steps into the illumination of one of the nearby lights. It's a homeless man, and he appears to have a bottle in hand. I tell myself it was most likely a late night drinker and proceed to walk over to the front door to let myself in. Of course, me being clumsy, I struggled choosing the right key as I had 5 others with me. This clumsiness would allow enough time for the homeless man to become more interested in my early morning struggle. "Excuse me, miss. Would you happen to have the time?" I look at my watch and it says 3:42 a.m., which I then relay back to the man. "Thank you. Also, could I go ahead and use your restroom?" "I'm sorry, but it's for paying customers only." "Why can't you just make an exception? Please, I won't take too long." Now I guess I should be honest. I'm the kind of person that is very shy, and a lot of times I do as I'm told as not to escalate things further worse. Even so, the guy was looking like he was clearly out of it, and I knew that if I let him into the store, he might try to attack me. Maybe I was being overly paranoid, but I'm this tiny 20-year-old female outside in the middle of the morning. Still, I thought maybe if I told him to wait a few minutes, I could lock myself inside as I wait for my coworker Joey, who would be joining me soon. "Sure, just give me a few minutes. Wait for me out here." I nervously open the door, but right as I'm about to lock it behind me, the homeless man reaches for the door handle and attempts to let himself in. I said, "Give me a second. Please back up." He then takes out a knife from his coat pocket, and those moments felt as if they had gone into slow motion. What didn't move in slow motion, however, were my cat-like reflexes. Seeing the knife, I book it to the restroom as he begins making his way in. As for the last frightening image I'm able to witness before I'm in the safety of the restroom, I see him charging at me before I slam the door right on his face. He then begins kicking and pounding at the door, telling me to let him in, otherwise I would be dead. I was so scared that even while on the line with the police, I struggled to give them any details of my location because I was panicking. Luckily, after a solid minute, they are more or less able to determine where I'm at, and they told me officers would be there shortly. Who knew shortly would be 3 minutes, because soon I am able to hear police officers shouting at someone to get down to the ground and drop the knife. Obviously, they were referring to the creep. After hearing what sounds like a struggle, the lady on the phone says that it was now safe to go outside. I really didn't want to, but one of the officers assures me it was safe. Even though my brain was telling me not to step out of the safety of the restroom, I do so anyway, and they were right. An officer was standing right there to greet me. I pretty much fell into his arms, crying and thanking him profusely. "No problem. We're just glad you're safe. Follow me. We need you to identify the individual." We walk over to the police cruiser and then he says, "Is this the man you were referring to?" He points to the homeless man who was in the back seat handcuffed. I tell him, "Yeah, that's him. He came charging at me with a knife. We have security cameras if you'd like to check." I show him to our security cameras, and after they review the footage, they are able to charge him later on. Finally, as we all step out of the store, my co-worker Joey is just arriving and he has a face of absolute confusion. Anyway, after some explaining and talking with our manager, he is able to get someone to cover for me as I go home to rest from the frightening experience. It took about a week for me to get back to work, but even then I was still very paranoid. It's been almost a year, and I've more or less now moved on from the incident. So this took place a few years ago. I only remembered it because I recently discovered scary stories on here. Actually, your channel was the first I found. So, to get you started, I live in northern Montana, and I was on my way back home from university. I'd been there most of the day, seeing as I had quite a few midterms. Add this and me spending time with friends, it's around 9 p.m. Anyway, as I mentioned, I'm walking home, taking the usual street I took, and I decided to stop at a convenience store to pick up some snacks. This usually consisted of some trail mix and a pink strawberry Snapple. As I'm waiting in line to pay, this older man walks in behind me, carrying some blue moons. He says, "Hey there, young lady. Is it just yourself this evening?" I was annoyed by his questioning, but as not to make a big deal, I say, "No, my parents are waiting outside. I just told them I wanted to get some snacks before we continued on with our road trip." Obviously, it was a lie, but I wasn't really in the mood for talking to strangers tonight. "Oh, what a shame. You have to leave so soon, do you? Such a beautiful girl like yourself. You'd make for a good wife." I wasn't sure if he was joking or not, but it was genuinely starting to creep me out, especially because of the way he said it. That and the smell. He smelled like he hadn't seen the shower in weeks. Finally, it's my turn to pay, and as I take my wallet out of my backpack, I now notice that Mr. Blue Moon is gone. So much for that. Anyway, I pay and began the next part of my walk, which meant I only had less than 10 minutes to go. Finally, a couple of streets from home, I noticed a silver Honda Accord slowly pull up, rolling its windows down. Guess who it is? It's the same man from the convenience store. "Hey, I thought you were on a road trip. Why are you out here all by yourself? Also, sorry about earlier. I can make it up to you. Want to come for a ride?" Either this guy thought I was naive or he was that desperate, but I wasn't falling for his routine. I tell him to leave, otherwise I would call for police, and this only seems to anger him. So much so he actually turns his car off and demands I get in. Once again, I tell him there's no way that's happening, and that's when he steps outside. To my surprise, he had a pocket blade, and he's walking up to me with a grand purpose. I lose it, and I began running like an athlete in the Olympics, jumping over neighbors' fences and into their backyard. All the while, I could see him try to give chase to me, but he ends up falling over when trying to get over a fence. Serves him right. With a stranger no longer in sight, I make a mad dash toward my home. I open the door, lock it, head upstairs, and proceeded to look out the window for the next solid hour. Oh yeah, and by the way, both my mom and dad were out for the weekend, so they didn't find out about what took place until after I called them. In fact, as I was on the phone with my dad, the same silver Honda Accord slowly drove down my street. It's as if the driver was trying to look for me, but to no avail. Eventually he gave up, and I never saw him again. I hope I never do. But as a precaution, I now carry pepper spray anywhere I go, and I also use Uber when having to be out at night. I will start off by sharing some details about myself. They might not seem too important to my story, but you'll understand why I mention them a bit later. So I'm 23 years old, female and around 5'3", 110 pounds, and I live with another roommate in a dorm right off of campus. Now, when this happened, my roommate, who we will call Emily, had been out of town, staying over at her boyfriend's family's house. See, this ended up happening in the winter of 2015, and most students had already left for the 5-week winter vacation. So now for some quick context on the dorm. It was 5 stories, holding about 20 living spaces per floor. Our living space was on the 5th floor, located next to a staircase. Also, this was the kind of apartment complex where you needed a key card in order to enter. This was done so that only people who lived there were allowed in. Say, for example, you ordered a pizza. The pizza delivery driver would click a button on a call box in order for the security guard to then buzz them in. From there, they can make the delivery. I only mention these details so you can get a better understanding. So it's around December 21st, 10 p.m., and I was on the couch binge-watching episodes of Breaking Bad. Remember the pizza example I gave? Well, I had ordered one too. No, I didn't throw it on the roof because I was angry. Extra points if you understand what I'm referring to. You'll know if you've seen Breaking Bad. Anyway, instead of having the pizza delivery man make his way to the 5th floor, I went ahead and met him in the lobby. And this is when I noticed something that would then lead to this series of strange events. When I paid for the pizza and the pizza delivery man was exiting, somebody walked up to the building and wanted the delivery man to keep the door open. Mind you, I watched this for a few seconds. The man looked a lot older, not like your typical college student. I would describe him as in his early 40s, receding hairline, fully grown beard, about 6'4", 270 pounds, wearing a Lakers jacket and some blue jeans. I did find him suspicious, but it's not to make a big deal about something that's probably explained. I ignored him and returned back to the elevator. However, he ended up following me, and he says, "Hold on, can you keep the elevator open for me?" Great. I almost considered just taking the stairs at this point, but I'm sure he would have followed me there too. So I tell myself I've read and heard way too many scary stories and I give him the benefit of the doubt. Besides, it only takes a few seconds to get up to my floor. But the next 20 or so seconds was awkward to say the least. First I tell him, "Hey, so are you going to choose a floor or what?" Mind you, I'd already chosen the 5th floor as it was lighting up on the little board. "Oh, no, I'm actually going to the 5th floor as well. I'm visiting a friend of mine, that's all." Again, giving him the benefit of the doubt, the doors close. And that's when he says, "You know, you made a really bad decision letting me in here with you." I nervously laughed, thinking that this was some sort of joke, but then I look at his face. It lights up, almost like a lion when it sees its prey. Great, this man was about to pounce. He starts by getting closer to me, which I can now see the buttons light up in front of me as well. 2nd story, 3rd story, the elevator was moving fast, and my best bet to get out of this mess was for the elevator to quickly open. He grabs my arm and commences to get closer to my face, and like an animal full of rage, I pull out a move straight out of something you would see in wrestling. I throw the pizza box at him and go for a kick downstairs to the balls, which causes this towering giant to fall over like a tree in a forest. Except unlike the saying that goes, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? This guy is full on telling me off while trying to get back to his feet, struggling to catch his breath. I go for another kick before finally the moments that felt like an eternity are relieved when the elevator doors open. I pretty much scream like a madwoman or like a banshee, trying to desperately get someone's attention. Luckily for myself, 2 college students that are friends of mine who I know are on the football team step out and are trying to figure out what the commotion is all about. I pretty much run over to them as Mr. Elevator Dude is full on charging at me with a purpose. I think he was so out of it he didn't realize he was about to get some sweet revenge. Without having to explain further, my two football friends literally suplex and tackle this guy to the ground while I call for the security downstairs. They get up there in about a minute and eventually police officers are called. Just as expected, he wasn't a college student and he wasn't here to see anyone. Although the question still remained, why did he go after me? After all, I'd never seen him before. I can only assume this next part, but here's what I think and what I theorize. Maybe he was trying to get lucky, if you want to call it that, with a college student and just so happened to have seen me and went with me. That's when he acted. So I guess it was the wrong place at the wrong time. I'm just glad that he was taken away, and I haven't seen nor heard from him ever again. For some quick information on myself, I'm female, 20 years old, and this took place about 2 years ago. I'm a singer and guitarist who enjoys playing at coffee shops on the weekends. For privacy reasons, I won't give you too many details. Also, this story spans a series of weeks, so I will tell you everything from the beginning. Anyway, one evening I had gone to visit a friend of mine who lived about 2 hours away from me. I brought my guitar with me so that we could play at her house. As it turned out, the coffee shop near her home was going to be throwing a small concert for various local artists. It was cool since their little venue could hold up to 200 people and would give me an opportunity to play in front of such a large crowd, and even a crowd that was brand new. This would lead to a series of scary events that actually put me in quite some danger. So the night arrives and I'm set to play in about 20 minutes. As I sat in the waiting area, this man, who I'd say is in his late 50s, comes up to me. He's a lot shorter than me, quite overweight, and has a lot of acne on his face. I figured that he was just trying to be friendly when he said hello, and I also figured that was going to be it. "Hey, I saw you a little bit earlier in the parking lot. Sorry, I was just looking at you, but I was too nervous to come say hello. You're really pretty. I was wondering, could we get a photo together?" He seemed kind of socially awkward, but I was nice and took a picture with him. "Thank you so much. You don't know how much this means to me." He then walks away, and I figured that would be the last time I'd ever hear from him. So it's finally my time to play on the stage. As I look into the sea of people in front of me, there he is right in the front row with his camera pointed directly at me. The entire time I played, he stayed quiet, just filming. Finally, the show ends, and I'm taking some photos with some new fans. Again, this man from earlier walks up to me, this time wanting to know some more personal things. I was wondering, now that we're friends, do you want to add each other on Facebook? Or maybe you have a Snapchat? Or do you want to exchange phone numbers? By the way, do you have a boyfriend? It'd be really nice to get to know you more if you don't have one. Friends? Since when were we friends? I tell myself. I ended up telling him I have a fan page, but my personal Facebook was for family only. The man kept insisting and wouldn't let me leave until I added him or gave him my phone number. I figured that as a way to get him off my back, I would give him a made-up number and then just leave. "Awesome. Let me go ahead and give you a call on your phone, just so I can confirm you aren't lying to me. Let me put it on speaker." I got the chills because I gave him the number of a local pizza shop near my house. I figured the look on his face when he tried to call me later would be one of confusion. Since the pizza shop was closed, it goes to voicemail. Sorry, but you gave me the wrong number. What's up with that?" "Oh, I see. You don't want to actually give me your real number, do you?" By now, his demeanor has changed and he started to get a bit more aggressive with me. My friend and I begin to walk faster to our car, but he follows. By this point, other people had overheard this creepy conversation and they were telling this guy to leave me alone. "Fine, be that way. See if I care." He then walks off into an alleyway. Trust me, I wish that was the end of my story. But this is about to get a whole lot worse. Fast forward a couple of weeks later, and I'm in the library studying for a midterm. All of a sudden, I get a friend request from somebody named Robert Anderson. Here's the big detail. I don't know any Robert Anderson, so I go ahead and open the app just to see who it could be. Wouldn't you know it, it looked just like the man from the concert a few nights ago. If that wasn't enough, I went onto my fan page and saw he had commented on almost all of my posts. They simply said, "I'm going to find you, just you wait." But if that wasn't enough, he sent some messages which had photos he had taken at the concert, each of them creepier than the last. It made me so scared that I actually ended up deleting the whole page and my whole profile. Yes, I know it's a little too extreme, but I wasn't taking any chances. Fast forward another week, and I hadn't heard anything from this creepy guy. I was at home by myself watching TV with my cat. It's around 1 in the morning, and I began to hear a light knocking on my front door. I thought it was the TV at first, so I ended up ignoring it. However, my cat Fluffy starts meowing and goes up to the door and begins scratching at it. Curious, I slowly start to tiptoe my way over so I could look through the small curtains. What I saw on the other side was one of the scariest sights of my entire life. I could see a dark minivan in my driveway. Also, that Robert guy, the one from the concert, was standing right in front of my porch with what looked to be like some sort of sharp object in his hand. But how? How did he find out where I lived? I never told him. Needless to say, I book it toward my phone and call the police. All the meanwhile, I am concerned he might try to break in at any moment. As I'm on the phone, I could hear something being thrown up against my kitchen window. I head over there fearing the worst, and as I enter, I hear something break. Yes, you guessed it. He had thrown a large rock at the window and was in the process of making his way into my house. I grab my cat and we both jump out the front door where a neighbor had just stepped out, presumably after hearing the crashing noise. I go up to him about a minute later and we began to hear sirens approaching our street. Thankfully, police had arrived and they head inside my home looking for the creep. They ended up finding him underneath my bed, but what was scary was that knife that he had the entire time, and what he planned to do with it is something that really gets to me even to this day. By the way, they found a bunch of rope and duct tape inside his car. I later learned that he was able to track me down, and that was the reasoning behind why he found out where I lived. It's been well over a year now, and I've since moved out to another state. My word of advice is this. Yes, be friendly to people. The world needs kindness, but be careful. There's some people out there that try to take advantage of that. At the time of this story taking place, I just moved out from home. I'm going to tell the entire story in its entirety so that I don't skip any important details. I was living in Wasilla, Alaska at the time, and I'd been trying to find a place to stay for quite some time. I ended up finding a place that was outside of town and more closer to the mountains. Pretty much consider it the Alaskan wilderness. The closest neighbors were at least 10 miles away from me. The town was at least another 20 minutes away after that. Growing up, I never was really a fan of being around people, so for me this was a perfect change. I was still in college at the time, by the way, but I had decided to take some online courses. This of course meant I wouldn't have to deal with actually going to campus. Sort of. The only times I would have to go to campus were when I would have to take exams. It just so happened on one of the days I was going to take an exam, I ended up having this creepy experience. This was in December, and for those who live in Alaska know all too well, it's pretty dark at this time of year. I will mention very quickly that I have a dog named Harold who pretty much kept an eye on the house for me while I was gone. One thing I'd started to notice around my property was my dog Harold acting very weird. He was a German Shepherd, so obviously he's very protective of me. When I have gone on walks with him in town, he's very friendly with almost everyone, but I could tell that he could sense the bad ones. He would usually start growling at them and look at the person with mean eyes. Well, for the last few nights, Harold had been acting very weird and it appeared he had been occupied by something in the nearby woods. I just dismissed it as some sort of animal. So on this Friday afternoon, I take Harold with me and we make our way to the car. As we're doing so, Harold starts growling once again. It seems like he's trying to get my attention on something. I did find it bizarre, but I told him to just calm down and relax. Soon, I saw what looked to be like the shadow of someone walking amongst the trees. Harold started barking, and I'll admit I got sort of nervous. Once again, I tell myself it was nothing. Well, guess what happened next? Out of all days, it seemed that my car wasn't working. Well, great. Thankfully, I do have my friend Alexis who was living near campus, so I ended up calling her. Hey Alexis, it's me. So you'll never guess, but it looks like my car isn't starting. I was wondering, could you come pick me up? If you do, I could buy you some food and pay for your gas. Wow, that's terrible. Sure, I could go pick you up if you want. You have to promise me one thing though. You gotta bring Harold with you. He's such a sweetheart. I'll look after him while you take your finals. Then we can get something to eat. Sweet, it worked out perfectly. Alexis could look after Harold and I could take my final exam in peace. It should have been a normal afternoon, but it would now change. Just don't forget the way Harold was acting in the shadow I had seen earlier. We go back inside and wait, and Alexis shows up about 45 minutes later. Thankfully, my final wasn't for another couple of hours. I was just going to go earlier to study, but I tried studying while I waited for her. She arrives and we ended up leaving. As we're making our way down my private road, me and Alexis see what looks to be like a person walking down the entrance to my property. I wasn't sure if it was one of the neighbors since they had a hoodie on, but we did find it strange to see somebody out here. He also resembled the same shape I'd seen earlier. Anyway, I try to put that person in the back of my mind and we arrive in town. I do end up taking the final and Alexis looks after Harold. Finally, after I was done and we had dinner, it was time to head back. It was a warmer night than usual. It was about 30 degrees, which for me was perfect walking weather. We drive on over to my property and make it back at around 9 p.m. I invited Alexis to watch a movie, and so she stayed a little bit longer, and we had made some s'mores and hot chocolate. While we sat there peacefully, Alexis got up to put the cups into the sink. Suddenly, she comes running into the living room with a concerned look on her face. Hey, Alexis, what's wrong? You look like you saw a ghost. I saw something. Come over to the kitchen and look outside. I was curious on what she was talking about, and with one quick look outside, we see what looks to be like a light, and then what's followed by a hooded figure. We keep looking. Now it appears like somebody's walking around in the snow. I wasn't sure who they were, but they were of course on my property. I now go outside to confront the person, but before I do, I hear the sound of a gunshot. It's at this moment I can tell that they're armed with a gun. Harold was surprised by the noise and now starts barking. I thought that if this person was out here, he was most likely going to try and break into my house. Against all logic, we ended up going out the back door and making our way into the woods to hide. Thankfully, in all that commotion, I couldn't believe it, but Harold actually behaved. But I think that's because we made it pretty far, and by that point, Harold hadn't detected the danger. Obviously, we had no idea if there was anyone else out there, but we didn't want to stay in the house had he found a way in. We start making our way down the road, and at the same time, Alexis is on the phone calling the police. We explained that somebody might be trying to get inside the house, and they said they would send somebody out to check it out. While she was on the phone, I called one of the nearby neighbors to pick us up at the end of the road. We meet up with my neighbor and wait for the police officers to arrive. They meet up with us and tell us that they'd go and check the area out. After walking around the area, they actually found the person who we had seen. He did make it inside the house and was hiding in one of the rooms. They took him away, of course. but it did take me a few days to want to return to staying back at home. I stayed over at Alexis's house for a few days. Nothing else has happened, but I did wonder why he was out there to begin with. Living in the wilderness is nice, but sometimes there are interesting experiences like that fuel your nightmares. This happened just a couple of weeks ago. I'm currently 16 years old, and I currently live in northern Michigan. I recently had just moved here about 3 months ago, so I was still fairly new to the area. This area I was living in was pretty cool. Me and my family owned a large amount of land out here. Around us are miles of woods and wilderness. One cool thing about the location of my house is that there is a large lake behind us. Here, you could find people that go swimming, people that are fishing, and people who are just on their boats. We get quite the interesting amount of people here, so it's not uncommon to find people that walk around. Anyway, on this one night, so much would change. As some background information, we do have a few neighbors, but they live further down the lake. So in order to get here, you do have to go down a road that goes through some woods. From there, you reach a crossroads. One way goes deeper into the wilderness, the other way heads into town. So yeah, on to the night in question. It was a Saturday night and I was working on a project for school. Even though the lake we live on is public, the area is closed off during the nighttime. Only people who lived in the area were allowed to be out by the lake. If you didn't have permission to be out here, you could get in a lot of trouble. This will be important to know later on. On this night, my parents and the nearby neighbors went into town to have a night out. I was left alone with our dog Jackson. My parents said that they'd be home at around 11 p.m. In the meantime, they ordered food for me and I worked on that homework. As Jackson and I sat in the living room, Jackson started to whine and scratch at the door. This was usually a sign that he had to go outside and pee. So I got up and take Jackson outside so he could go ahead and do his pee business. Jackson was always full of energy, so he ends up going to his favorite spot that was a little ways into the woods. I follow him in and I ended up waiting for him. Once we start walking back to the house, I ended up noticing something quite odd. I saw what looks to be like a boat on the lake near my house. They had what appeared to be an old-fashioned lantern. I found this strange because as far as I knew, my neighbors were out with my parents. No one was supposed to be out here. I disregarded it and went back inside, however, and I called my parents and then the neighbors to see if perhaps they had returned from their night out early. They told me that none of them were there. This was really turning out to be strange, but it would get worse. You see, from the kitchen, you have a perfect view of the lake below you. I can now see that the boat was slowly approaching the shore. I had the light off so the people on the boat couldn't see me. Slowly, the boat comes to a stop, and I see two people slowly start to make their way out. I couldn't really see too well, but it looked like they were wearing dark clothing. Another thing I noticed that sent chills was it appears like they have knives. It was hard to tell, but I was pretty sure that's what they had. As they slowly start examining my house, I knew now that they were up to no good. Here I am, in the middle of nowhere, by myself in this house, with no neighbors or no mom and dad. Almost immediately I grab Jackson and we both go into our parents' upstairs bedroom and hide. I get on the phone at that point and I'm soon on the line with the police. I explain the situation and they tell me that they'll send some police officers right away. As I waited there, I could hear the sounds of yelling outside. That was then followed by the sound of them trying to open the doors. In that moment, I thought they were seriously going to be making their way inside the house. I remember that I closed all the windows and doors, so if they did manage to get in, it would take them some time. Suddenly, I hear the sound of something crashing. I would later find out that they broke one of the windows. Now, for some reason, I was guessing they had a change of heart, because I soon heard the sound of their boat engine turning on. I looked out the upstairs window and saw as they started driving their boat down the lake and down the river. Seriously, I think the police officers must have stopped for coffee and donuts because by the time they arrived, those two had gotten away. They arrived and I explained the entire situation to those officers. They pretty much told me that they'd keep a lookout for them, and so I gave them a description to the best of my ability. I couldn't really see the boat, however, so I wasn't able to give them a good description of that. Sadly, our poor living room window was broken. I'm guessing they must have thought I called somebody, and that's when they decided to just leave. When my parents got home, you can imagine their reaction to seeing the mess. They were just so surprised that something like this could happen. I was more surprised that they still hadn't been found, however. Even though I didn't see the boat, there was one time when I was walking in the woods with Jackson and I started being followed by two people in dark hoodies. I was unsure if it was related to the two from before, but as soon as me and Jackson went back to our house, the two of them just seemed to run back into the woods. The other night, me and my mom saw two suspicious people walking around our property. My dad was out doing some work at the time, so it's just us. Once again, we called police officers, but they don't find anyone. All they found were muddy footprints on our front yard. Police officers and even some park rangers have been searching the area, but so far no new updates to report. Our neighbors have also been keeping a lookout for them as well. As some sort of update, however, we have installed cameras around our house, so if anything comes up and they're caught on tape, I'll make sure to update you all so you can see what's going on. Growing up in Wales, I lived in a town that was near some woods. I was 15 years old at the time when this took place, back in the late 1980s. These woods held many mysteries to them. No, it's not because of the many kilometers of endless trees. Well, that could be part of it. It's because there were certain areas that had many old abandoned buildings and areas that were off limits to the general public. Something else we did have was an old hospital that was still running. I always did find this strange, but I never did question it. Oh, I guess I should mention, it was a mental hospital, to be more exact. The only thing I knew was that there had been a lot of passings in the woods in the past, and people had been escaping that mental hospital, but officers normally took care of all of that. Anyway, with that background information out of the way, you can see why my encounter in the deep wilderness was that much more eerie. My parents worked long hours, so they were almost never home. I decided that one day out of boredom I would take my dog William with me and we would go into the nearby woods. With me I brought my backpack with the usual supplies I took with me into the woods. We proceeded to have a great time. I did see the areas that were off limits and me and William made sure to avoid these certain areas. I was more interested with a lake where people would go swimming and have picnics with their families. We went there and spent the majority of the day with other families that we saw. Going back down the familiar trail in the wilderness later in the afternoon did always make me a little bit more cautious, but I had William with me this time, so I wasn't too concerned. Seemingly out of nowhere, however, William started whining and then growling. This was weird, but I wasn't sure why he was doing it. We continued to walk for another couple of minutes, and I start hearing the sound of mumbling. Now, I knew we weren't the only ones out there at this point, so I looked around, and instantly, I saw a very tall man. I wouldn't say he was that old. He actually looked to be like a teenager. I think with the lighting and since he was tall, it made it look like he was older. He was wearing a hospital gown, which I did find sort of weird. I did try to rationalize everything and figured that he was just a patient from the nearby mental hospital, just enjoying a peaceful nature walk. But when I really started thinking about it, I thought otherwise. All of a sudden he started chasing me, and this is when me and William started to run. I could tell the poor guy wasn't really all there in the head. But looking back, I felt bad for him. But in that moment, I wasn't too sure what to think. We kept on running as I can hear all these different sounds that he was making. Eventually, it seems like he's given up interest and I made it back home. Immediately, I called police officers and I explained the entire situation. They thanked me, but I was confused as to why. I soon learned that one of the patients had gotten out of the nearby mental hospital and they had been spending the last couple of hours trying to find him. He was said to be harmless, but of course, like I said, I didn't know in that moment. As a twist in this story, I told the police officer if I could get the contact information for his family. He wanted to know why, and eventually I was able to get some flowers sent to his family so they could give it to the son, aka the one that followed me in the woods. It was a weird thing to do from what my friends told me, but I'm sure the family appreciated those flowers. I never did hear from them and I never looked more into it, but at least I knew in my mind that I was able to turn such a startling experience into something nice in the end. Last week, my girlfriend and I wanted to go on a weekend backpacking trip into the wilderness. Our plan was to go to some nearby canyons where we could go camping and also take the opportunity to explore. These canyons actually connected into a state park. We were more interested in the area with the view of the entire valley below us, however. When we arrived, we parked our car in the familiar parking area, then started making our way up various trails. It should be noted that many people do come out here and go camping, but for some strange reason we only saw one other vehicle parked there. It was in late September, so it could have just been that the season for camping was over for most people. We just didn't want to go in the summertime since it was so hot. The first day that we got there, nothing out of the ordinary happened. That was until later that night. After we had set up camp and started to relax for the night, we hid inside the tent to try and get some sleep. I was tired from all the walking we had done, but suddenly I was awoken by my girlfriend. I was confused as to what she wanted, but she told me she had heard sounds of people walking around our campsite, and she even saw light too. Though it had nothing to do with what we encountered later on, it did make us a little bit nervous nonetheless, especially considering that we hadn't seen anyone that entire day. Day 2, we actually cut our trip short because it had actually started to rain. We didn't want to stay out here because if it got really bad, it would have been a problem. Although we did come prepared for rain, we didn't think it was going to be this bad. We ended up finding natural cover below a large tree, and then threw a tarp over us so we could wait out most of the rain. Once everything seemed to have settled down, we started making our way back to the car. We had large backpacks with us, and though we had trained with them, it was still hard to walk around with so much mud. Thankfully for us, we had the option of walking down a road that wasn't dirt. This was pavement. This was mainly used by park rangers and others who needed to get around the park. It was a relief, and it did offer a break from all the walking in said mud. Also, we had walked down this road before, and it does circle back down to the parking area. Well, that relief would soon turn into the complete opposite. Soon we start hearing what sounds like movement in the nearby woods. Now, this noise didn't sound like it belonged to a human being. Instead, it sounded like some sort of wild animal. Now, the series of events that happened next makes me so thankful for being in the right place at the right time. Out walked 2 bear cubs. They were adorable, but what sent chills is what we saw next. We saw 2 large bears not too far off. Our immediate thought was that those were the parents. If there is one thing we know, it's you don't go near any baby bears whatsoever. We immediately froze. We were just hoping the little baby bears wouldn't come any closer. But of course, they did. We weren't sure what to do. If we start running, they might get startled, and those 2 parents could get angry. We were both hungry at this point, but sure didn't want to be on their dinner plate. Well, seemingly out of nowhere, we hear what sounds like a vehicle approaching. It just so happened to be park rangers who were driving around the area. Thank God the bears didn't attack, and they ended up leaving. The park rangers met up with us, and soon enough were taken back to the parking area. They told us that we were in the right place at the right time. It just so happened that somebody was almost attacked by a mama bear just a month ago. That story definitely made our encounter that much more scarier. In the end, we were just happy that we made it out in one piece. How's that saying go in movies and in books? Home sweet home? Sure, it should be home sweet home for the majority of us. But what happens when that peace and comfort is intruded upon, and the innocence is taken away without your permission or even your input? Surely, it's not only going to leave you paranoid out of your mind, but it's also going to leave you confused. These emotions, even to this day, stick with me, and even though I now live across the country, I can't help but feel as if I'm being watched, even now as I share this with you all. My lesson in the real world, if you want to refer to it as such, takes us all the way back to the year 1998, northern Texas. I returned from work, and as soon as I pulled up into the driveway, I had this really strange feeling. I wasn't sure. Maybe it was the food I'd consumed earlier for lunch that day, but I do recall really having to use the restroom really badly. That's why I didn't waste a single moment, making a mad dash toward my front door, throwing the mail on the couch, then placing myself on the toilet. I won't get into those details, but after I'd finished and I walked over to the kitchen to grab myself a bite to eat, I happened to see something that sent chills down my spine. There are muddy footprints all over the tiles. It had been raining earlier in the day for sure, but the last thing I would do is walk inside my own house with muddy shoes. I was, and I still am, a neat freak, but I knew in that moment that cleaning up was the least of my concerns. Where did these footprints come from? Well, I chose to take matters into my own hands. I chose to grab the largest kitchen knife I could get my hands on, and then I quietly tiptoed my way over to my room. No one was in there, but there was something in here I was looking to retrieve. My shotgun that's in my gun safe. I grabbed that bad boy, and then I start to do a scan of each room. Bathroom where I was, empty. Guest bedroom, nothing. All that remained was the basement. So, I open the basement door, flick on the light, and within seconds, I finally have an answer. Sitting in the basement all alone in the dark was a random disheveled man who appeared to be in his mid-30s. He's got a handgun lying beside him, and I seriously thought that when this man saw me and the shotgun, he would just get up and apologize, or maybe use the gun. But instead, he said he wasn't moving, and that if I wanted him out of my house, I would have to call the police. But that wasn't all he said, however. He also said that he was going to fight the police all on his own, and he would take them out if they tried to get close. This guy clearly had something wrong with him, and he was on a mission to get himself shot. At this point, I tried to come up with options, but ultimately I did call authorities since he wasn't listening to whatever I was telling him, and besides, the last thing I needed to do was to have him shoot me. 10 minutes pass, and I'm outside with a neighbor keeping a lookout at the house, and the cops pull up into my neighborhood. I told them about the man with the gun, and luckily the police decided to do something smart. They not only tell everyone to lock themselves in place, but they call for backup too. Both myself and my neighbor ended up watching what happened through his window. Basically, after a negotiator talked with him over a loudspeaker, the police were able to get the man to surrender, and everything was resolved peacefully. I did learn that he was the oldest son of somebody a few blocks away that I never met. He was a troubled individual who was off his medication that day, and he was trying to break into random homes. Why he sat in my basement waiting to be discovered, those are questions I wish I knew the answers to myself. But that's my story of the time I arrived home from work, only to discover a troubled man who had broken into my home with a gun. Something that I used to enjoy doing was urban exploring. I love the idea of going out and exploring abandoned places and learning of their history. Something about standing in a spot that used to be filled with so many people is really crazy to think about. I think that's why I had such a passion for it. And when this happened, I'd gone out to the desert with my dog and cousin. We had planned on visiting this old abandoned town that used to be populated back in the 1800s. It was those sort of towns you'd see in the old cowboy movies. The first thing we did was make a stop over to my uncle's house to pick up a few supplies that we would need. Whenever we wanted to go camping, we could always rely on him to give us our camping gear. Once we put our gear in the back of the car, we make the 2-hour drive into the desert. When we had arrived, we noticed that there weren't any signs of people or cars. Obviously, the last car we had seen on the highway was about 20 minutes ago. When we took the exit and drove down this lonely stretch of dirt road, all we saw were miles of desert and a few cattle. When we finally arrived at the town, we parked our car and proceeded to walk over to the abandoned town itself. We figured we could set up the camp later that night. When you first stepped into the town, you were welcomed by this old sign that seemed to be barely standing up. Once you passed this sign, you could see all these old buildings. Down this road, there were buildings on each side. We were able to see what looked to be a couple of old saloons, a barber shop, a convenience store, and even what looked to be like a doctor's office. We explored the inside of the buildings and proceeded to take a bunch of pictures, but of course there's not really much left after all these years. I'm not sure why, but when we stepped inside one of the saloons, we suddenly got this feeling that we were being watched. Another thing was the sudden cold breeze. I mentioned this because it was still a warm 80 degrees outside, and this made it feel like it was in the 60s. This actually made our dog react, and she started to whine. I should have realized it then, but it appeared she was sensing something this whole entire time. I did my best to calm her down, and we continued on to the second story. Walking around to the upstairs area, we are welcomed with a dark and lonely hallway. I'll admit, with how dark and quiet it was in there, we almost considered just leaving right away because it was pretty spooky. Still, we weren't going to let our nerves get to us. We slowly start making our way into some of these run-down rooms, finding a variety of objects. We find some broken leftover bottles, the frames of beds, and even some old creepy dolls. The sight of the dolls are what really sent chills to me because I've never been a fan of dolls, especially finding them in this old abandoned saloon. This is when things got really weird. We started to make our way downstairs and heard the sounds of movement below us. We both thought it was weird, but when we looked around, we had seen nothing. It turns out that there was an old basement area right beyond a broken door. When walking over to it, our dog once again started whining. It really seemed like she wanted nothing to do with this place because she kept pushing back. That should have been our sign to leave. I tell my cousin we can each take turns and go down and see what the basement had. The other can wait with the dog upstairs, since the dog didn't want to go down there. I make my way down this old staircase, with each step making a loud noise. With the phone I have, I carefully descend to find what looked to be like an old storage room. I remember stepping on a food wrapper, and I found this strange because it looked fairly recent. This place had been abandoned for at least 100 years, but perhaps there had recently been some squatters. Suddenly, I start to once again hear movement and a voice. I point my phone towards the end of the hallway that has the flashlight on, and right there staring back at me was what appeared to be a group of men. Immediately, they get up without saying a single word and slowly start making their way over to me. I instantly yell and start running back up the stairs. My cousin doesn't even get a word out because immediately she realizes what's going on. We now all exit the saloon building and make our way over to the car. Behind us, we can see as these two are chasing us, one appearing to be holding a sharp broken bottle, and the other one has a knife. We finally arrive back at the car and get back in, and it seemed my dog wanted to stop and confront them because she wouldn't get in. This wasn't the time, nor the place, so I struggle to get her inside. By the time we get in the car, they catch up to us and start trying to open our doors. The one with the bottle is hitting the side of the window trying to open it. The other one now seems to have what looked to be like an old crowbar too. Before they are able to get in, however, we are able to make our way out of there. After that happened, we never returned back there. But one thing was for sure, we never forgot those creepy people. Hello everyone. This is the first time I've ever shared my creepy stalker experience online. Hopefully, you can all learn from what I had to go through. Although looking back, I wish I didn't have to experience this. To get you all started, I will give you a bit of background context. This started happening in late 2011, where I had just recently turned 18 years of age. I live, and still live, in a small suburb in Seattle, where day-to-day life is pretty simple. I go to school, study, go to work, go home, and rinse and repeat. At the time, I'd recently gotten a job working at a coffee shop. It was nice because it allowed me to save up some money to spend on whatever I wanted. Well, only a couple of weeks after my employment, I started to notice something kind of odd. At first, it was just a simple hello, but then it turned into seeing him all the time. Who am I possibly speaking of? This older man, late 40s, that was homeless, who would enter our store just to sit around and look at his phone. Not sure how he had one, but I didn't want to judge. Well, anyway, I welcomed him in with open arms, as my other coworkers sorta just ignored him. He seemed friendly at first, but I think he might have gotten the wrong message. You see, one day it was extra slow and I was on my own while another coworker was in the back baking some of the sweets. Seeing as we had no customers for the past 30 or so minutes, I was studying some of my chemistry homework. That's when I noticed he entered the store. I say hello to him and he just brushes me off. I figured maybe he was just having a bad day. It happens to us all the time, and maybe he just wanted to sit in his usual spot. After about 5 minutes, I started noticing he had his cell phone directly pointed at me, almost as if he was recording. I could tell because he quickly put his phone down when I called him out on it. He apologizes, and then he proceeds to walk up to the countertop. This is when the creepiness would begin. At first, he's saying things like, "Hey, how is your day going? You know, I've never properly introduced myself, have I?" Then it started to get worse. "You're very gorgeous. By the way, do you have a boyfriend? I think you and I could get along pretty great. We should hang out sometime." I thank him for the kind words, but I tell him I'm already seeing someone. He looks annoyed at this information and follows up with something more or less like, "Oh, what a shame. Well, I'm sure if I got him out of the picture, then you would gladly accept me, wouldn't you?" The way he said it really made me feel like he was full of malice. Regardless, I just laugh it off. He proceeds to now walk out of the store, and the rest of the night goes fairly uneventfully. Fast forward a couple of weeks and I hadn't seen him. On this one night, I was closing by myself and I was in the process of locking the back door. By the way, the back door leads you into an alleyway. From here you walk for about 20 seconds until you reach the couple of parking spaces we had for our coffee shop. Well, I'm walking down this alley when I ended up hearing the undeniable sounds of footsteps. Considering it was midnight and I hadn't seen anyone, I tell myself I was just hearing things and it's my paranoia and imagination. But when I turn around, I just barely catch the glimpse of a tall shadow running behind a large dumpster. Scared out of my mind, my first instinct was to call out my coworker. He does like to play pranks on people, but then I thought about something. He had left an hour ago, so it couldn't have been him. Well, after 10 or so seconds of uncertainty, the shadow walks out from behind the large dumpster and the details become more apparent. Stepping into the poorly lit alley light, the homeless man I hadn't seen in weeks had now returned. Only this time, he's got a knife. And not just any kind of knife, mind you. This was a hunting knife. I freeze as he slowly starts to approach me, which by now my mind was finally telling me to run. I do, and I'm booking it, heading as fast as I can to my car. All the while, I can hear his heavy breathing getting closer and closer to me. Without moments waste, I click the button on my car keys and I jump inside the safety of my vehicle. But what happens next is him banging on the window, telling me to open up if I knew what was good for me. I'm pretty much in tears as cracks are beginning to show. At any moment he was going to break in. As my nervous and sweaty hands put the key into the ignition, I book it right out of there. You can just imagine how scared I was. So instead of going home, I drive over to the police station, where I'm a nervous wreck. I now proceed to tell the lady police officer what had just happened, and they have an officer go and check things out. Of course, the homeless man was long gone. But that wasn't the end of it. A couple of nights later, I was home alone sitting on the couch watching some television when the house phone started to ring. I get up thinking that it might be my parents checking up on me, but instead I'm welcomed with an oh so familiar voice. It was Mr. Creepy Homeless Alleyway Dude. "Hey, open up, precious. Please, I just want to talk." How in the world he had my house phone number, I still don't know to this day. But regardless, I start sweating when I hear loud knocking at the front door. I quickly run upstairs, where I lock myself in my parents' room and call the police department. The police arrive 10 minutes later, only to find the house and surrounding property is empty. What they do find, however, was evidence of the screens for the windows being slashed. To think, he attempted to break in. Well, the calls continued for a couple of more nights, until just like that, everything went silent. It's like he just disappeared, and like he got abducted by aliens or something, because I no longer saw him, nor did I ever get any sort of phone calls from him. I'm not sure if he moved on or, like I said, aliens, but even police officers were able to confirm that they haven't heard from him. I'm just hoping he isn't after someone else, or he's just waiting to come after me again. But in the meantime, I'm a lot more aware of my surroundings. I carry pepper spray with me, as well as a taser, and I no longer walk at night by myself. This happened just last night. It's a short story, but still I wanted to go ahead and share it with all of you. Since it is so fresh in my mind, I thought I would tell you all about it. I'm currently 28 years old and I live in a rural town in Arizona that's in the middle of nowhere. Out here there's a lot of nature reserves and farmlands. So anyway, one day I invited my cousin Dorothy to go out fishing one late afternoon. There was a river that wasn't too far away from my house. That's where we would go quite often. This afternoon was like any other. We grabbed our supplies and headed on over to the river at around 6 p.m. It was about 20 minutes down a trail, and soon enough, he would arrive. Once there, we sat down next to the water and proceeded to do our fishing. We had brought some food and a little radio with us as well. In the end, we actually ended up staying out there a little longer than we expected. By now, the few people we had seen had already left, and it was just myself and Dorothy remaining. Now, it was about 9 p.m. With there being only light from our phones and the stars above us, it was now time to head back. During our walk back through this little bit of wilderness, there was no noise whatsoever. Here's where I would like to get some explanation from all of you, at least those who might have an idea. As we were walking, the noise we had heard from earlier had just suddenly stopped. The wind we had heard, the crickets, and other little animal noises we were hearing seemed to have stopped just like that. There was this cool breeze in the air that suddenly picked up out of nowhere. We found it strange, but what was even stranger was this sudden smell of blood. This was then followed by what sounds like somebody mimicking our laughter from earlier. It was in this moment that me and my cousin started sweating from the obvious mysterious noises, as well as that smell of blood. We took this opportunity to pick up our pace, and that's when we saw it. In the faraway tree line, we can see what looks to be like a woman with long hair. Perhaps somebody that was just walking around the woods? Possibly. But as far as I knew, I don't think any normal person walks around at night in the woods, especially without some sort of light source. My cousin and I are now in full-on run-back mode to the house. While doing so, we can hear the sounds of running in the woods. We do make it out of there and back to the house. Once inside, we made sure to lock everything up, and I happened to look out the window. And at the very far end of my property, I can now see what looks to be like something walking around in the woods. It was hard to tell, but it definitely did seem like somebody was out there. Kind of best to describe it as a tall human with antlers or something, definitely different from what we had seen earlier. Now, I've heard many stories and urban legends about this area, including about something called the skinwalker, but I never really did believe any of that. But perhaps this experience did kind of open up my mind a little bit. I did talk to some neighbors that lived farther away from me, but they told me that they weren't out there that late, so it wasn't them. I don't know. What do you think it was that we experienced? It sure would be nice to get some more insight from people who might be more knowledgeable on this sort of thing. Thanks in advance. This happened a few years ago during the summertime. My friend Ronnie and I were really into filmmaking, and we were trying to create our very own horror movie. However, we soon came to the realization that we would need to get a lot of B-roll. This included some night shots, which, like the name suggests, has to be done at night. Therefore, Ronnie decided to stay over at my house to save the back and forth driving. At around 8 p.m., we get into my truck and drive about 20 minutes to a trail we used to run on when we were in high school. We chose that location because there are some really cool underground tunnels that we thought would be a perfect shot for one of our scenes. In order to get to the said trail/tunnel, we had to park and then walk about 5 minutes on the trail to a section that goes down a hill. There's some train tracks you follow, and not too long after you've reached the tunnels. And now, admittedly, going out there in the middle of the night is a really bad idea. You don't need to tell us otherwise. But we are these 20-year-old college students who think that we can possibly take on the entire world. So anyway, with our flashlights, we arrive without any issues and then start to take some pictures with the flash. This was, for the very first time, we realized that we might not be alone. At first it started with tree branches being stepped on. We assumed it was one of us creating the noise. However, we realized that there were no tree branches anywhere near our feet. We wrote it off as a wild animal. No less than 20 seconds later, we noticed a large figure stand up from just a bit of a ways inside of the tunnel. At this point, our eyes had adjusted to the dark, which was why we were able to see it. Pointing our flashlights in their direction reveals a homeless man who's holding onto a crowbar. "What are you two kids doing out here?" We didn't respond. We grab our bags and start to run. But then we begin to get surrounded by more people. Some of them had knives, while the others just stood there staring. We were really thinking we would have to fight our way out of this creepy situation. "Get them," the one from the tunnel commands, as about 5 of them begin charging their way toward my friend and I, who are now visibly shaking. Thankfully, at the last second, we are able to jump out of the way and start booking about the way we came from. We didn't have to wait too long, however, because about 20 seconds of running, we look back and they are starting to walk back from where we had encountered them. That was pretty much all there was to it. We ended up driving back to my place and decided it was a better idea to stick to filming B-roll in our backyards. Update: we ended up telling the police about them, but as of this writing, there hasn't been any updates on whether or not they were caught. I'm assuming they might have been drifters or hitchhikers and decided to camp out there thinking nobody would bother them. Still, why would you come after some filmmakers? I'm not sure, but we like to think they might have just been trying to scare us. It wouldn't have made for some awesome footage had we actually decided to record them, but we were so caught up with the emotions, we didn't think to do it. When I was in college, I'm female by the way, I was part of an undergraduate program that allowed me to conduct research at a lab in Panama. I don't want to get into too much boring detail, but I was going to be in Panama for the summer in the rainforest, collecting and analyzing samples. All of my lab mates and I had been working hard for a couple of months, and we all decided to take some time off and explore Panama City. My roommate and I shared a love of shopping. She was from China, and although sometimes there was a language barrier, we got along really well. Her and I decided to go to a mall all on our own, while our lab mates, who were mostly guys, decided to go elsewhere. Breaking off from our group was not exactly the best idea. While I spoke Spanish and could navigate, My friend slash roommate could not. We struck out on our own, and not 10 minutes later, we find ourselves taking a shortcut down an alleyway in the middle of Panama City. A pickup truck filled with guys turned down the alleyway behind us, so we moved to the side so they could pass us. They pulled up right next to us, slowly down to our walking pace, and started saying greetings to us. I smiled and timidly waved back at them, hoping that they would soon drive off because something about the situation just felt really off. The men suddenly sped up to the end of the alleyway and then turned around and started driving back slowly. They were saying some not so nice things now, commenting on how our bodies looked. My poor roommate could tell that their demeanor had changed, and she asked me what they were saying. I told her it wasn't good and that we needed to get out of that situation now. Luckily, just before the truck reached us again, there was another side street that we ducked into, and there were several people walking down the street. We hurried away and glanced back just in time to see the truck with the creep stop at the entrance of the street that we had just come from. They looked angry, but luckily they just sped off. My roommate and I breathed a sigh of relief and vowed never to take any more alleyways. The rest of the trip went without a hitch, and I highly recommend visiting Panama City, Panama, if you're ever able to.